The man from the land company came out to Delphia Rourke's place on a Tuesday in the fall, the way those men always seem to come on a Tuesday, when a person is tired and the week is not yet halfway spent. He wore a coat that had never held a bale and shoes that had never crossed a feedlot, and he laid a number down on her kitchen table like it was a gift she ought to be grateful for. The number had a great many zeros in it. Delphia was 91 years old that fall, and she had buried a husband and a mentor, and more than one notion of how the world was supposed to reward a person for being right. She looked at the number for a long while. Then she looked at the man, and she told him that the land he wanted to buy was the same land the whole county had once watched her plow behind a tractor that smoked like a brush fire, and that she had not held on to it through the year everyone else ran dry, just to hand it to a stranger with clean shoes. She said no. She has said no every year since. And if you want to understand why a woman would turn down that kind of money to keep a quarter section of Boone County dirt, you have to go back to the summer of 1978 and to the thing Harlan Voss said in front of the whole grain elevator, loud enough that men laughed for a year. What Harlan Voss said was this. He said, "Delphia Rourke's fixing to plow Nebraska with a wood stove on wheels." He said it at the co-op scale in July, with a dozen men standing around waiting on their tickets, and the men laughed the way men laugh when someone else is the one being made small. It was a good line, as those things go. It had a picture in it. Everybody could see the picture the moment he said it, and a picture is what sticks. For the better part of a year, a man could not mention Delphia's name at that elevator without somebody saying wood stove on wheels, and somebody else laughing, and the whole thing coming back around fresh. She heard about it the way you always hear about those things secondhand, from a neighbor woman who thought she was doing Delphia a kindness by telling her. Delphia thanked her for the coffee and drove home, and did not say a word about it to Werner, because she knew what Werner would say, and she did not have the room in her that year to be told she was a fool by the two men she was surrounded by, the one she had married and the one who had made her a joke. You have to know what the Rourke place was in 1978 to understand why she did what she did. It was 240 acres in the eastern part of Boone County, corn ground mostly, with a low draw along the north line where the water stood in a wet spring, and nothing much grew but foxtail. Vern Rourke had farmed it for 30 years the way his father had farmed it, and his father before him. And there is no shame in that. But there is no future promised in it either. They were not poor, the way some were poor in those years, but they were the kind of not poor that is only one bad turn away from the other thing, and everyone who farms knows exactly the feeling. The tractor they ran was an old gasoline machine that Vern kept alive with baling wire and stubbornness, and the price of the gasoline that fed it had begun in those years to do a thing that gasoline had never done in living memory. It had begun to climb, and then to be, on certain weeks, simply not there at all. People forget now how strange those years were. There had been a shock in 73 when the lines formed at the filling stations and the signs went up that said no gas, and everyone told themselves it was a one-time thing, a foreign trouble that would pass. It did seem to pass, but Delphia Rourke did not think it had passed. She was a reader, which was itself a thing certain men in the county held against her, and she read the farm papers and the regular papers, and she read the writing on the wall in a way her husband would not. She had grown up the daughter of a man who lived through the Dust Bowl and came out the far side of it with one lesson burned into him, which he had burned in turn into her, and the lesson was this. The thing everyone believes cannot happen is the exact thing you had better be ready for. Her father had watched neighbors who owned no plow they could pull, and no seed they had saved, and no way to feed a horse once the corn was gone. And he had sworn his family would never again depend for its survival on something that came from somewhere else and could be taken away. Delphia carried that. It was the whole architecture of her, though she would not have used that word. So when the gasoline began to climb and to disappear, Delphia did not do what her neighbors did, which was to complain about it at the elevator and then pay whatever was asked and go on. She went looking for another way, and the other way, when she found it, was so old it looked new, which is how the best answers usually look. She found it in a man named Jakob Reinhardt. And to tell you about Jakob, I have to tell you about a kind of person that the county had, in those years, mostly stopped seeing. Jakob Reinhardt was one of the Volga Germans, which meant his people had gone from Germany to Russia generations back to farm the steppe along the Volga River at the invitation of a Russian empress, and had then, when Russia turned hard against them, come across the ocean to the plains of Nebraska and Kansas, because the plains looked like the steppe, and the wheat they carried in their pockets grew there as if it had always meant to. They were a people who knew about hard ground and hard winters, and about making a thing last past the point where other people would have thrown it away. Jakob had come to Boone County as a young man and grown old there, and by 1978 he was a widower, well up in his 80s, living alone on a few acres at the edge of town, keeping chickens and a garden and a memory that most of his neighbors assumed had gone soft. It had not gone soft. It had merely stopped finding anyone who wanted what was in it. Delphia knew Jakob a little the way everyone knew everyone, and she went to him because of a thing he had said once, years before, at a funeral supper, that had lodged in her and would not come loose. He had said, watching the men complain about diesel prices even then, that in the war the Germans had run their trucks and their tractors on wood, on nothing but wood, when there was no gasoline to be had in the whole of Europe, and that he had built such a machine himself as a young man and driven it, and that the Americans had forgotten a thing the whole rest of the world had once been forced to learn. Nobody at that supper had paid him any mind. Old men say old things. But Delphia had filed it away, the way she filed everything, and when the gasoline began to fail her, she drove out to Jakob Reinhardt's place with a pie as her excuse, and sat at his table and asked him to tell her about the machine that ran on wood. What Jakob told her, over the course of that afternoon, and a good many afternoons after, was the thing the rest of the world calls wood gas, and that he called by its German name, which was Holzgas. The idea of it is simple enough to say, and hard enough to do, that the saying and the doing are two different countries. You do not burn the wood to run the engine. You starve it. You build a sealed steel vessel, a gasifier, and you fill it with blocks of dry wood or corncobs or charcoal, and you let it smolder with far too little air, so that instead of burning to ash it breaks down and gives off a gas. That gas, Jakob told her, was mostly hydrogen, light and clean burning, and once you had cooled it and filtered the tar and the ash out of it, you could pipe it straight into the intake of an ordinary engine, and the engine would run on it and never know the difference, or hardly any. A truck, a generator, a tractor, anything with a spark and a piston. The Germans had run 1,000,000 such machines in the war, he said. 1,000,000 and more, when Delphia would not have believed there were 1,000,000 such machines in all the world. The whole of occupied Europe had rolled on wood smoke while the tanks got the last of the oil. Delphia sat with that. She was not an engineer, and she never claimed to be one. And part of what makes her story the kind of story people still argue about is that she did the thing anyway, with an 86-year-old man's memory for a blueprint and a welding rig that Werner barely trusted her to touch. Jakob could not build it himself anymore. His hands had gone, and his eyes were going, but his memory was a clean and terrible thing, and he could tell her the diameter of the throat, and the depth of the hearth, and the reason for every baffle, and why the cooling pipes had to run just so, and what would happen if the filter was an inch too shallow, which was that the tar would foul the valves, and the whole thing would seize inside a week. She wrote it all down in a school notebook with a pencil, sitting at his kitchen table, and she went home, and she built it in the machine shed with the door shut. She built it wrong the first time, and the second time, and the wrongness of it was expensive in the only currency she had that year, which was time and scrap steel and the goodwill of a husband who came into the shed one evening and stood looking at the contraption bolted to the back of his tractor and asked her, in the flat voice he used when he had decided a thing was foolish, Whether she meant to burn the whole place down before or after, she made them the laughingstock of the county. She told him she was already the laughingstock of the county, thanks to Harlan Voss, and that a person who was already laughed at had nothing left to lose by being right. Verna did not have an answer for that. He went back to the house. It was the closest thing to a blessing he was able to give her that year, and she took it as one, because you take what is offered. The machine, when it finally ran the way the important things in a life tend to arrive, which is without ceremony, and after you have half stopped believing, they will come at all. It was a morning in the early spring of 1979. She had charcoal in the hopper, and a fire started in the hearth, and she cranked the blower and waited, and the gas came, and she held a match to the test port the way Jakob had taught her, and it lit with a small, pale flame that meant the gas was good and clean and ready. She fed it to the engine. The engine caught. It ran rough for a minute, and then it smoothed. And Delphia Rourke sat on a tractor that was pulling a plow through Boone County dirt on a fuel that had cost her nothing but sweat and cordwood. And above the stack there rose a thin gray banner of smoke that a man a mile off could see and did. The smoke was the thing they saw first, and the smoke was the thing they never let go of. A gasifier smokes when you light it and when you shut it down, and sometimes in between if the operator is careless. And Delphia in those first weeks was as careless as any beginner, so the smoke was there for all to see. Harlan Voss saw it from his own place across the section line and told it at the elevator, embroidered the way a thing gets embroidered, until in the telling Delphia's tractor was on fire, was always on fire. Was a rolling disaster that would take out a shelter belt one day and half the county with it. Wood stove on wheels. The line came back around. Men drove past her field slow to get a look and drove on shaking their heads, and one or two, to their small credit, waved. Most did not. There is a particular loneliness in doing a hard and correct thing in front of people who have already decided you are a fool, and Delphia lived inside that loneliness for the better part of a year, and she has said since that the only thing that got her through it was that Jacob Reinhardt, when she drove out to tell him the machine had run, had wept, an old man in his kitchen, weeping, because a thing he carried across an ocean in half a century had finally been of use to someone before he died. She said that was worth more to her than the whole county's opinion put together, and I believe her, because of what she did later, which was to keep the notebook. Then the summer of 1979 came, and the gasoline that had been climbing and flickering simply went out. People who did not live through the summer of 1979 have a hard time believing how it was, and people who did live through it have a hard time forgetting. The trouble was overseas again, a revolution in a country most Boone County men could not have found on a map, and the oil that came from that part of the world stopped coming the way it had, and the whole vast machine of American life, which had been built on the belief that the fuel would always be there, began to shudder and stall. The lines came back to the filling stations, longer than in '73. There were days a station had gasoline, and days it did not, and a farmer could not know which kind of day it would be until he had waited in the line for 2 hours to find out. The state brought in a system where a man could buy fuel only on certain days, depending on the last number of his license plate, odd days and even days. And the elevators and the co-ops that sold diesel and gasoline to farmers began, that summer, to ration what they had, because there was not enough of it, and everyone wanted it at once, and it was planting into summer, and everyone needed it at once, which is the cruelest possible timing, and of course, exactly when it happened. A farmer lives or dies by his window. There is a stretch of days in the spring when the ground is ready and the crop must go in. And if you miss that window because your tractor is dry, you do not get it back, and the whole year bends around the missing. That summer, all across Boone County, tractors sat. Good men with good ground and good seed sat in their yards and watched the days of the window fall off the calendar one by one, because the tank was empty and the co-op had no diesel, and the station had a line 4 hours long, and a 2-can limit when you got to the front of it. Harlan Voss sat. The men who had laughed at the elevator sat. The whole county near enough sat and burned daylight and money and hope, waiting on a fuel that came from the far side of the earth, and had decided, that summer, not to come. Delphia Rourke did not sit. She had a woodlot, a few acres of scrub timber down in the draw along the north line, the same low wet ground that had never grown a decent crop. And she had a winter's worth of cordwood already cut, and a machine that turned it into motion. She got up before light those mornings, and lit the hearth, and let the gas build while she drank her coffee. And by the time the sun was up, she was in the field, plowing, planting, doing the work, while her neighbors' machines stood cold. The smoke rose off her stack, the same as it always had, the same thin grey banner that Harlan Voss had made a joke of. And now the men who drove past, slow, did not shake their heads. They stopped. They got out and stood at her fence line and watched a woman do, on wood, the thing not one of them could do that summer on all the oil in Arabia, and the watching was a different kind of watching than it had been the year before. It was the watching of men doing arithmetic they did not like the answer to. She has never pretended it was easy or that the machine was equal to a tank of diesel. It was not. It was slower to start, and it wanted tending, and it made perhaps 2/3 the power, so she ploughed a little shallower and drove a little slower and stopped to shake down the hopper and rake the ash. But 2/3 of the power on a machine that ran was infinitely more than the whole of the power on a machine that sat dry in the yard. And every acre she turned that summer was an acre her neighbors could not turn, and the arithmetic of that was plain to anyone with eyes. By the middle of that summer, Delphia Rourke had her crop in the ground, and a good part of her neighbors did not, and the county had gone quiet on the subject of wood stoves on wheels. The first man to come to her and ask her to teach him was not Harlan Voss. It was a younger fellow from over east, a man named Cletus Hoyt, who had a young family and a note at the bank and a tractor that had not moved in 3 weeks. And he came to her yard with his hat in his hands, which is an old phrase, but I use it because that is nearly how it was. And he asked her plainly, without much pride left to spend, whether she would show him how to build the thing on the back of his machine. Delphia looked at him a while. She could have made him wait. She could have made him say the words wood stove on wheels back to her, could have collected a little of what the county owed her, and no one would have blamed her much. She did not. She said she would show him, and she said it that same week, and she drove over to the Hoyt place with Jacob Reinhardt's notebook on the seat beside her, and she showed him. That is a thing about Delphia Rourke, that the people who tell her story sometimes leave out, because it is less satisfying than the version where she gloats. She did not gloat. She taught. Before that first summer was out, she had shown 4 men how to build a gasifier, and then 8, and Jacob Reinhardt, who had spent 40 years being a soft-headed old foreigner that no one wanted to sit next to at the funeral supper, found himself, in the last full year of his life, receiving visitors. Farmers came to his little place at the edge of town and sat at the same kitchen table where Delphia had sat, and asked him to tell them about the throat, and the hearth, and the baffles, and he told them, and his memory poured out of him into the county like water out of a well that everyone had assumed was dry. Delphia arranged it. She could have kept the knowledge and been the only one who had it and made herself the queen of the whole enterprise, and instead she drove men out to Jacob's kitchen, because she understood a thing about where the knowledge had come from and what was owed for it, and because she wanted the old man to have that year. He died the following winter, in his sleep, and half the county came to the funeral, and the man they buried was not a soft-headed old foreigner anymore. He was the man who had shown Boone County how to plow through the year the oil ran out. Delphia paid for the stone. It is a good stone. It says his name and the years of his life, and, underneath, in letters she chose, a line in his own language that means, more or less, The old ways are only lost to those who stop asking. I have wondered, telling this, what it was in Jakob Reinhardt that let him carry a thing for 40 years without bitterness, waiting on a county that had no use for him, and I think the answer is in the way Delphia described his last winter. She said the visitors changed him but did not surprise him. He had always known the machine was true. The truth of it had never depended on whether anyone came asking. He had simply gone on believing it in an empty kitchen, the same as he would have believed it in a full one. And when the kitchen filled at last, he received the men without triumph and without reproach, as though they were only a little late, which he seemed to feel they were. Delphia said she asked him once, near the end, whether it had galled him. All those years of being the old foreigner nobody wanted to hear. And Jakob thought about it and said no, in his slow, accented English, that a thing that is true is not made less true by being ignored, and that the only real loss would have been to stop believing it himself, to spare himself the loneliness of holding it alone. That, she said, was the deepest thing he taught her, deeper than the throat and the hearth, and she spent the rest of her life proving she had learned it. She held true things through long, empty years, and did not let the emptiness talk her out of them. She learned it from a man who had learned it on the far side of an ocean, in a language most of her neighbors could not speak, and she taught it to a granddaughter who keeps it now in a drawer, and the machine was almost beside the point. The machine was only the thing the lesson happened to be wrapped around. Harlan Voss came last, and he came in the fall, after the harvest had sorted the county into those who had a crop and those who did not, and the sorting had not been kind to him. He had gotten a little in the ground, late, on fuel he had paid a wicked price for, and it had come up thin and uneven, and he had watched Delphia Rourke's corn stand up green and full across the section line all summer long, fed on nothing he could not have grown himself in his own woodlot, if he had not spent the previous year making a joke of the woman who grew it. Pride is an expensive crop. It takes the best ground and gives back nothing you can eat. Harlan Voss had planted a whole field of it at the co-op scale in July of 1978, and in the fall of 1979 he came to Delphia Rourke's yard to see what the harvest of it was. He did not take his hat off. That was not in him, and Delphia did not expect it. He stood by his truck, and she stood on her porch, and for a while neither of them said the thing they both knew they were there to say. Then Harlan Voss looked out across the section line at her field, the stubble of it now, the corn already in the crib. And he said, without turning to face her, that he supposed she had heard what he said at the elevator. Delphia said she had. He was quiet a while longer. Then he said the nearest thing to an apology that a man like Harlan Voss had in him, which was not the word sorry, because that word was not in his vocabulary where a woman was concerned, but was instead a question. He asked her if she would show him how to build the machine, and Delphia Rourke, who had every right under heaven to tell Harlan Voss to plow Nebraska with the wood stove of his own hard words, looked at him a long moment and said the thing that I think is the truest measure of her, truer than the machine, truer than the standing corn. She said, "Harlan, I'll show you Tuesday. Bring your own notebook." She showed him Tuesday. He built his gasifier that winter with her standing in his shed correcting his welds, and it ran. And Harlan Voss plowed on wood for the next several years the same as half the county did, and he never once thanked her in words that anyone heard. But he changed, in the small, slow way a hard man changes. And years later, when a young fellow new to the county made some joke about the smoke off a gasifier, it was Harlan Voss who told him to shut his mouth, that the woman who ran that machine had more sense in her ash rake than the whole elevator had in its head, and that he ought to go and ask her to teach him before winter. That is how you know a man has truly turned. Not when he apologizes. When he defends you to the next fool in line, using the very words that were once used against you, turned now to your side. Harlan Voss became, in the end, the fiercest guardian of Delphia Rourke's name in all of Boone County. And there is a lesson in that which I will come to, because it is the hardest lesson in the whole account, and the one she means for you to carry home. The oil came back, of course. It always does for a while. By the early 80s, the lines were gone, and the fuel was there again, and cheaper than it had been. And one by one, the gasifiers of Boone County came off the tractors and went into the backs of sheds and were forgotten. Because that is what people do the moment the crisis passes. They forget, and they go back to the easy way, and they laugh a little at the memory of how frightened they were. Most of the men who had built machines let them rust. Delphia did not. She kept hers. She kept it clean and covered and ready. And she kept Jakob Reinhardt's notebook in a drawer in the kitchen wrapped in an oilcloth. And when Werner asked her once, late in his life, why she bothered, when the oil was cheap and would surely stay so, she gave him the answer her father had burned into her half a century before. She said the thing everyone believes cannot happen is the exact thing you had better be ready for. Werner did not laugh at her that time. He had stopped laughing at her a long while back, somewhere in the summer of 1979, watching her plow. He died believing his wife was the smartest person he had ever stood next to, which is a thing not every man manages to arrive at, and to his credit, he arrived. Now I have to tell you about June, because a story about being ready is not finished in one life, and Delphia understood that better than anyone. June was Delphia's granddaughter, Emmett's girl, and Emmett had been one of the doubters too in his day, a young man in 1978 embarrassed by a mother who welded contraptions in the shed and got herself talked about at the elevator. Emmett came around slower even than Werner, because a son's embarrassment is a stubborn thing, but he came around, and his daughter June never had to come around at all, because June grew up on the far side of it. In the years when her grandmother was not the county joke, but the county's quiet legend, the woman who plowed through the year the oil ran out. June was a serious child in the way certain children are serious, and she followed her grandmother around the place asking why, and Delphia answered every why, because she had learned from Jacob Reinhardt what happens to knowledge when the person who holds it decides no one wants it. When June was 14, Delphia took her out to the machine shed and pulled the cover off the gasifier and taught her to run it. Not as a museum piece, as a working machine. She had June light the hearth and build the gas and hold the match to the test port and watch for the pale, clean flame. And she had June feel the moment the engine caught and smoothed, and she gave June the notebook, the actual notebook, Jakob Reinhardt's own pencil marks in a dead man's hand, and she told her what it was, and where it had come from, and what was owed for it. She told June about the funeral supper, where an old man said a true thing that no one wanted, and about the line on the stone in the language June could not read, and what it meant. The old ways are only lost to those who stop asking, too. And she told June that the notebook was hers now, and the machine was hers, and that her only job was to keep asking, and to keep it ready, and to pass it to someone when her own time came to pass it. June has it still. June is a grown woman now with children of her own, and the notebook is wrapped in the same oilcloth in a drawer in her own kitchen, and that, more than the land, more than the money, is what Delphia Rourke built. She built a chain of people who refuse to stop asking. The land is just where the chain is anchored. I have made that summer sound like a straight climb from mockery to vindication, and I owe it to Delphia to say that it was not. The nights were hard. A gasifier is not a thing you light and walk away from. It is a live fire in a steel box bolted to the back of a machine, and it wanted watching the way a sick animal wants watching. And there were mornings that spring when the gas would not come clean, when the wood was a shade too green, or the filter had packed with tar overnight, and she stood in the cold shed before light coaxing it, cursing it under her breath in the flat, dry way she cursed, while the good planting hours ticked past outside. There was a week in June when a valve fouled anyway, tar on the seat exactly as Jakob had warned, and the engine lost a cylinder and ran on 3, and she had to pull the head herself by lantern light because Werner was asleep and she would not wake him to watch her fail. She got it running again. She always got it running again. But I want you to know it cost her, because the version where it is easy is a lie. And the lie does a disservice to every person who ever stood alone in a cold shed at 4 a.m, trying to make a hard, correct thing work, while the easy, wrong thing beckoned from the yard. Vern came out to the shed the morning of the fouled valve, near dawn, and found her black to the elbows with the head off and the parts laid out on a feed sack in an order only she understood, and he did not say anything for a while. He had spent a year not quite believing in the machine, and here it was broken down and proving him right, and a smaller man would have said so. Werner did not. He went back to the house and came out again with 2 cups of coffee, and he set one down on the fender where she could reach it, and he stood there in the cold, and he asked her, not unkindly, whether she needed a second pair of hands. She did. She had needed them for a year and been too proud to say. She said yes. And the 2 of them got that head back on together in the grey light, Werner holding and Delphia turning, not saying much, and when the engine caught and smoothed on all 4, he did a thing he had not done in front of her in a long time, which was to laugh, not at her this time, but with her, at the pure, improbable fact of the thing running on wood smoke while the whole county sat dry. That was the morning their marriage came back around, out there in the shed. She has said it plainly. She said a lot of marriages die not in a fight, but in a slow drift, where one person stops believing in the other, and that hers had drifted a long way out in the year of the wood stove jokes, further than she let herself feel at the time, and that it came back, not with an apology, but with a cup of coffee set on a fender, and a question about whether she needed hands. She said, that is how the real repairs get made. Not with the big words. With somebody showing up in the cold, before light, and asking to help hold the thing while you turn it. The neighbors came too that summer, in their 1s and 2s, and Delphia learned something about people in the coming of them. She learned that the men who had laughed loudest were not mostly the men who came first, and that the men who came first were the quiet ones who had never laughed at all, who had watched the year before with something held in reserve, and who now simply drove into her yard and asked. She learned that it is not usually your enemies who surprise you, but the quiet people at the edges, the ones you never counted as either friend or foe, who turn out when the hard day comes to have been paying closer attention than anyone. Cletus Hoyt was one of those. So was a widow from the south of the county, older even than Delphia, who did not come to learn the machine for herself, but drove all the way over just to sit in Delphia's kitchen one afternoon and tell her that she had watched her plow all summer, and that it had done her old heart good to see a woman proven right in front of the men who doubted her, and that she had waited her whole life to see it, and had about given up. The 2 of them sat and drank coffee and did not say a great deal. Some vindications are like that. They do not need many words. They just need one other person who understands exactly what was survived to arrive at them, and Delphia has said that the widow's visit was worth more to her than the standing corn. The same as Jakob's tears were worth more. And I begin to think that is the truest thing about her, that she measured the whole business not in acres or in dollars, but in the small number of people who truly saw, and that she counted herself rich on a handful of them. By the fall of that year, the thing was settled in the county's mind, though no one announced it, and no one apologized in any general way. It was simply understood, the way things become understood, that Delphia Rourke had been right, and that the smoke off her stack had been the smell not of foolishness, but of foresight, and that a person might do worse than to have a woodlot and a notebook and a machine in the shed against the next time the world decided to stop sending oil. Some acted on the understanding, and most did not, because most people never act. They only understand and then forget. But the understanding was there, and it changed how the county spoke of her for the rest of her long life. She was not the wood stove woman anymore. She was the woman who plowed through the year the oil ran out, and mothers pointed her out to daughters. And that is a kind of monument you cannot buy and cannot inherit, and can only earn by standing in a cold shed being laughed at for exactly as long as it takes for the laughter to run out of road. Which brings me to the land, and to the auction, because there is one more turn in this account, and it is the one the county talks about most, though I have come to think it is the least important of them. Harlan Voss farmed another 20 years, and then he got old, the way we all get old, and his sons had gone to the cities and did not want the ground. And when Harlan died, the home place came up for sale at auction on a cold, clear morning in the spring. The quarter section that lay across the section line from the Rourke place, the very ground from which Harlan had once watched Delphia's corn stand green while his stood thin. Delphia was an old woman herself by then, past 80, and she did not need more land, and had no one telling her she ought to want it. But she went to the auction. She stood at the back in her coat with her hands folded, and she listened to the auctioneer run the bidding, and when it came down to the end, between her and a young operator from 2 counties over who farmed 10,000 acres and wanted 10,001, she raised her hand, and she kept it raised, past what the ground was worth, past what was sensible, until the young man shook his head and let it go, and the auctioneer said sold, and the ground where Harlan Voss had planted his crop of pride came at last to belong to the woman he had made a joke of at the elevator. She did not do it to gloat. I want to be careful about that, because it would be an easy story to tell wrong, and the wrong version is uglier and smaller than the truth. She did not buy Harlan Voss's land to stand on it and feel tall. She bought it because Harlan Voss, in the end, had become one of the people who kept asking, one of the chain, the man who told the young fool at the elevator to go and learn before winter, and Delphia did not want that ground going to an operator from 2 counties over who would tear out the shelter belts and lay it to a single crop, and never once wonder what the old man who farmed it had learned in the year the oil ran dry. She bought it to keep it in the chain. She said, when someone asked her why, that Harlan had earned better than to have his life's ground handed to a stranger with clean shoes. And if that phrase sounds familiar, it is because she said the very same thing, near enough, to the man from the land company all those years later, sitting at her kitchen table looking at a number with a great many zeros in it. Some things a person only has to learn once, and then they say them for the rest of their life, because they turned out to be the whole truth. The man from the land company did not understand. They never do. He thought she was holding out for a bigger number, and he came back twice more with bigger numbers, and each time she told him no. And the last time she told him no, she also told him, because she was 91 and had stopped minding whether she was understood, the whole of it. The tractor, and the smoke, and the wood stove on wheels, and the summer the county sat dry while she ploughed. Jacob Reinhardt and the notebook, and the line on the stone. June, and the oilcloth in the drawer in June's kitchen. She told him all of it, and the man from the land company listened, the way a man listens when he is waiting for the other person to finish so he can restate his offer. And when she was done, he restated his offer, a little higher. And Delphia Rourke understood that she had been speaking a language the man could not hear, which was the same language Jacob Reinhardt had spoken at the funeral supper all those years before, to a room full of men who could not hear it either. And she thought, she has said, that this was the whole shape of her life laid out in one kitchen, that the true things are always spoken first to people who cannot hear them, and that the work of a life is to keep speaking them anyway, and to find the one person in the room who can, and to hand them the notebook. So here is the lesson, and I am going to give it to you the way she gave it to me, which was plain and a little hard, because Delphia Rourke did not believe in the soft kind of lesson that lets everybody off easy. She said the county did not laugh at her in 1978 because her tractor smoked. The smoke was just the excuse. She said the county laughed at her because she was doing a hard thing that reminded them of a hard thing they did not want to do, which was to look squarely at the fact that everything they depended on came from somewhere else and could be taken away, and that they had made no provision against the day it would be. Her machine was an accusation, she said, and people do not laugh at an accusation because it is foolish. They laugh at it because it is true, and because laughing is cheaper than changing. That is the hard part. The mockery was not a judgment of her. It was a confession of theirs. And the moment the oil ran out, the mockery stopped. Not because she had proved herself, but because the thing she had been accusing them of had come true in their own dry tanks. And a man cannot laugh at an accusation while he is living inside the proof of it. She said, and this is the line June had carved onto a small plaque that hangs now in the machine shed beside the covered gasifier. She said, "They don't laugh at you because you're wrong. They laugh at you because you're early. And early looks exactly like wrong right up until the morning it doesn't." That is the whole of it. That is what she wanted you to carry home from a story about a smoking tractor in a Nebraska field 40-odd years ago. Not that she was clever, though she was. Not that she was proven right, though she was. But that the distance between wrong and early is nothing but time, and that the only people who ever make it across that distance are the ones who can bear to be laughed at for the length of the crossing. Most people cannot bear it. That is why most people wait in the line at the filling station. Delphia Rourke could bear it, because a man named Jacob Reinhardt had shown her that the alternative to being laughed at is being unready, and being unready when the day comes is worse than any laughter. Laughter you survive. The empty tank in the planting window you do not. She wanted that understood down to the bone, because she had watched good men, proud men, men who had laughed at her, lose a whole year's living, not to drought or hail or any act of God, but to the simple failure to have imagined, in the fat years, that the fat years might end. That failure of imagination, she said, was the only sin she ever saw punished reliably on this earth. The land forgives a great deal. It forgives a poor crop, and a wet spring, and a young farmer's mistakes. It does not forgive a man who bet his whole survival on a thing he did not control and made no provision for the day it failed him, and it does not forgive him because it cannot. The failure is not moral, it is arithmetic, and the arithmetic comes due in the 1 week of the year you cannot get back. There is one thing more, and I will leave it with you the way she left it with me, unfinished, because she said some things are not mine to finish. When Jacob Reinhardt died, Delphia kept his notebook, and everyone in this account has heard about the notebook, the gasifier, the throat, and the hearth, and the baffles. But June told me, the last time I spoke with her, that the notebook has a second half, that the back pages, the ones her grandmother never taught from and never spoke of, are written not in Jacob's careful diagrams, but in something denser, columns of figures, and a few lines of German that June has never had translated. And that when she asked her grandmother once what was in the back of the notebook, Delphia Rourke went quiet in a way she almost never did, and said only that Jacob had carried more across the ocean than one machine, and that some of what he carried he had asked her to keep until the county was ready for it, and that the county was not ready yet. Then she closed the drawer. June has the notebook now. June has never translated the back pages. She says she is waiting, the way her grandmother taught her to wait, until someone comes asking the right question. She says she will know them when they come. And when I asked her what she thought was written back there, in a dead man's hand, in a language she cannot read, she smiled the way her grandmother used to smile and said that was a story for another day.